Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Let's do it.
Today, we're digging into the world of archaeology and metal detecting.
Oh, interesting.
And, it's funny because at first glance, you might think these two groups would be, best buddies,
Allies.
right?
Yeah.
Both totally fascinated by history.
Yeah.
But as we'll see from our main source today, this report from the National Council for Metal Detecting,
Oh, okay.
there's actually quite a bit of tension.
There is. And this report really highlights a lot of the mistrust that metal detectorists have with archaeologists and institutions like the Portable Antiquities Scheme.
The PAS, yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of like they're both playing the same game,
Mm-hmm.
but with totally different rule books.
Yeah.
Which, as you can imagine, leads to some serious clashes out there in the field.
Makes sense.
So we're going to try to, understand why that is. But like I said, this report makes it pretty clear that there's a deep well of mistrust among detectorists towards archaeologists.
Yeah, it's not just like a vague feeling either. It's rooted in very specific grievances.
Right.
Which the report highlights right away.
So let's dive right into those grievances, shall we?
Here.
The first one that jumps out at me, at least, is the frustration with this thing called the Portable Antiquities Scheme.
The PAS.
CAS, yes.
Yeah, the PAS is designed to record archaeological finds made by the public.
Right.
But detectors kind of feel like there's a serious lack of communication from them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like changes are made to the system without really consulting them, and there's this general sense of being disregarded.
Like their contributions just aren't valued as much as they should be.
Exactly. And one of the big issues is how find locations are recorded. So the PAS now requires an 8-figure grid reference,
Okay.
which is super precise, like almost down to the square meter.
Wow.
And detectorists argue that this level of precision is just unrealistic because artifacts can move over time, due to things like plowing or even just the weather.
Oh, yeah.
Like, how can you be that precise about something that could have moved over hundreds of years?
Right. It's almost like trying to map the exact location of like a leaf that's been blown around in a windstorm for centuries.
Right. Like, they want that data for research purposes, but detectorists are saying, like, hey, we're out here in the field dealing with the realities of the landscape. You're asking for something that may not be possible.
Yeah, and it's not just that it's difficult. It also highlights this really fundamental difference in perspective.
Yeah.
It seems like archaeologists, working in labs and research settings, they place a very high value on this precise context.
Yeah.
But for detectorists who are actually out there in the field, the emphasis is probably more on just the discovery itself.
Yeah, and rescuing it from potential damage.
Yeah, exactly. And the report really underscores that difference in perspective. Makes you wonder if that's part of what's feeding into the mistrust.
Absolutely. That gap in understanding just breeds mistrust.
And speaking of mistrust, this report reveals a pretty shocking incident that really seems to have shaken the detectorist community.
Yeah.
It turns out that a number of artifacts were stolen, not by some shady art thief,
Right.
but by a PAS officer.
That's right. And this really, really struck a nerve. Like, the report emphasizes this feeling among detectorists that the response to this theft was super muted compared to, say, the public outcry over the thefts from the British Museum.
Right. So it's like one group's losses are seen as like this national scandal, and the other is barely even acknowledged.
Exactly. And that, again, just feeds into this feeling of being undervalued and disregarded. It's a big theme in this report. And this issue of trust becomes even more important when you think about all the conflicting priorities.
Okay, tell me about that. What are those conflicting priorities? What's really at the heart of all this tension?
So the report claims that the PAS is basically discouraging landowners from even allowing metal detecting on their property. Yeah, they're essentially saying artifacts are better left undisturbed, preserved for future generations. Now, that might sound reasonable on the surface, but
the detectorist community sees it as an attempt to control who gets to discover history.
exactly. Like, archaeologists are saying, we'll decide when and how these artifacts are unearthed. Thank you very much.
Like archaeologists get to hold the keys to the past.
Right. And they decide what's worth saving and how.
Wow. So it's pretty clear there's a lot more to this relationship than meets the eye.
Definitely. And the mistrust we've been talking about makes it all the more complicated. And, this whole idea that the PS is trying to, control access to history is kind of fueled by another issue the report brings up, this thing called Archi.
Archi. Okay, remind me what that is again.
Right. So Archi is this online subscription service, right? It gives users access to a database of find locations.
Right.
And the data is coming from the PAS database.
Oh, I see.
The problem is the NCMD, they found out that this information is being scraped. Basically, somebody's copying it without permission.
Oh, wow.
And they're worried about data security and potential misuse.
So it's like someone sneaking a peek at the PAS's notes without even asking.
Yeah, exactly. And it raises all these concerns about, like, transparency and who's actually in control of this sensitive archaeological information.
Right.
The NCMD feels like the PAS just isn't doing enough to protect this data.
Which, again, kind of adds to that whole us versus them thing.
Totally. It's like they're saying, hey, you want us to be super meticulous about recording our finds, but you're not even taking care of the information we give you.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And this mistrust, it gets even worse when you consider another big concern from the report. Artifacts getting lost, damaged, or even stolen while they're, like, under the care of the PAS.
Oh, wow.
So to look into this, the NCMD, they submitted a Freedom of Information request to the British Museum,
Okay.
asking about their procedures for tracking artifacts in the PAS system.
Interesting. And what did they find out?
Well, basically, the response was like, we don't have that info. You got to contact each individual museum, each finds liaison officer for those details.
Wait, so there's no central system for tracking these artifacts within the PAS. That seems like a pretty big oversight.
It does, right. And the NCMD points out that the organization overseeing the PAS, they should definitely have a clear idea of what's happening in their own system, especially when it comes to something as important as these artifacts.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this lack of a tracking system, it's even more concerning when you read about the NCMD's experience at this PAS advisory group meeting.
Okay.
They brought up this whole issue of lost or stolen artifacts.
Yeah.
And they were told that, like, that was impossible because all the museums use this secure storage and management system called Spectrum. Spectrum, yeah.
Okay.
But here's the thing. The NCMD, through their own experiences and investigations, they knew that just wasn't true. Not every place that handles artifacts uses Spectrum.
So what are they doing at those other places? Like, is there even any protection?
Exactly. It's like saying that all banks are Fort Knox when, some are just rickety old sheds with a rusty padlock.
Right, right.
So this whole discrepancy just raises serious doubts about the PASS's, like, transparency and commitment to keeping these artifacts safe. It's no wonder detectorists are feeling uneasy.
Yeah, for sure. So to recap, we've got a system that feels opaque and unaccountable to detectorists.
Right.
And then on top of that, there's no clear process for making sure these artifacts are actually safe.
Exactly. And remember that incident we talked about earlier where the PAS officer was found to have stolen artifacts? The Cumbria case?
Yeah, the one where the detectorists felt like their concerns were totally ignored.
Well, the report actually goes into some pretty troubling details about how that whole thing was handled. So initially, the NCMD was told that the missing artifacts were just, like, mislaid during an office move.
Mislaid.
Yeah, that's what they were told. But later on, it came out that there was no office move and that the artifacts were actually stolen.
So they were straight up lied to.
It definitely seems that way. And when the NCMD tried to get more information, especially for their members who were directly affected, they hit a brick wall.
It's like they were trying to just sweep the whole thing under the rug.
Exactly. And again, you see this stark contrast with those British museum thefts.
Right.
One incident causes this huge public outcry. The other is barely even acknowledged.
It's crazy.
And the NCMD makes this really powerful point in the report. Do detectorists not matter? Are we not also tax-paying members of the public?
It's a good question.
They deserve the same accountability and respect that everyone else in the heritage sector gets.
Yeah, I agree. So what happened next? Did they ever get any answers about the Cumbria case?
Eventually, they were told that the investigation was finished and they'd decide about potential charges soon. But then, like, months went by with no updates. Yeah, total radio silence. It's
Yeah.
just another example of that lack of communication and perceived disregard that's fueled all this mistrust between the detectorists and the PAS.
It's frustrating for sure.
It is. So at this point, you've got to wonder, where do we go from here? What does this mean for the future of metal detecting and archaeology?
Yeah, that's a big question.
It is. But despite all these challenges and all this mistrust, the NCMD report does end on a somewhat hopeful note.
Oh, so there's like a light at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah, a little bit. They tacked on this addendum to the report. It describes a meeting between the NCMD General Secretary and the head honcho of the PAS.
Oh, okay.
And it sounds like it was a pretty productive meeting, focused on better communication and collaboration between the two groups.
So maybe there's hope for a truce, after all.
Mm.
It's interesting, though, right? They lay out all these grievances, all this mistrust,
Yeah.
but they still seem open to finding a way to work with the PAS.
It shows you that both groups are really driven by the same passion. They love history and they want to protect it.
Yeah, just figuring out how to do it together.
Exactly. And that starts with building trust.
Okay, so let's talk solutions then. Earlier, we were talking about the NCMD's proposal for mandatory metal detecting surveys before construction projects.
Right.
Sounded like a good way to save artifacts, but we also touched on how that might not always be, the best approach.
Yeah.
So what are some of the other ideas they put forward? What are they recommending for actually improving the relationship between these two groups?
Well, one of the biggest things, and probably the hardest to actually pull off, is more transparency from the PAS. Detectorists want clear guidelines for recording finds,
Okay.
a more responsive system for dealing with their concerns, and they want to be more involved when decisions are made, decisions that affect them.
So basically less secrecy and more open dialogue.
Pretty much. It sounds easy, but it means both sides need to change their way of thinking.
Yeah.
Archaeologists need to recognize that detectorists are making valuable contributions. They need to be seen as partners.
Right, not just sources of information.
Exactly. And detectorists need to trust that archaeologists actually do have history's best interests at heart, even if their methods don't always make sense.
Yeah, it's a two-way street for sure. So besides communication, what else does the NCMD suggest?
More education for both sides.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, imagine workshops where detectorists and archaeologists can learn from each other,
Yeah.
Share best practices and figure out what's ethical.
Like finding a common language.
Yeah.
So they're all on the same page.
Exactly. And the report emphasizes that landowners need to be part of this too.
Oh, right.
Educate them about responsible metal detecting. Let them make informed decisions about what happens on their property.
So it's a collaborative effort,
Yeah.
not just archaeologists calling all the shots.
So it's about shared responsibility.
Yeah.
The NCMD's vision is basically a world where detectorists, archaeologists, and landowners all work together.
Raw.
Everyone playing their part to protect history.
That's a really cool vision.
It is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main thing that stands out to you? What do you hope our listeners take away from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that even when there's conflict and mistrust, there's always hope for working together. The relationship between these two groups is messy, but at the end of the day, they both care about the same thing. History, and if they can tap into that shared passion, we can all gain a deeper understanding of our past.
Very well said. And to our listeners out there, we encourage you to dive deeper into this topic yourselves. We'll be sure to link to the full NCMD report in the show notes. It's a really interesting read, full of great insights.
Lots to think about.
Definitely. And as always, we want to hear your thoughts. What were your big takeaways from this deep dive? What do you think the future holds for archaeology and metal detecting? Let us know on social media. Let's keep this conversation going.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep digging up the past.